This is Darkly PreStory, a novella from the Darkly Sweet, Wicked Witches, Curses, and Kisses world. Written by Juliann Whicker, read by Hudson, her AI assistant. Chapter 1. In September. The air buzzed with excitement above the rolling cadences of the raucous calls and cheers from the audience. Witches and mages started stomping on the metal stadium floor in almost unconscious time, faster and faster. Pitch versus Lit. It would be epic, a tourney battle to go down in history. The pro-tourney field was bigger than Rosewood Academy for Witches and Mages' stadium, crowded with witches and mages from every walk of life, along with a few Darksiders drawn to see our world's greatest tourney player, Pitch Black. Everyone knew who would win. Pitch had been killing it, not quite literally, but her opponents had to be dragged in pieces off the field when she was finished with them. Pitch Black and Lit Up had been one of the longest running teams in the tourney circuit until they broke up last year. Now that they were adversaries, everyone wanted to see if Pitch would show her loyalty to her old partner or destroy her as mercilessly as she consumed everyone else. A scattershot of white lights flickered on the field, painfully bright after the darkness of the night. A figure appeared in the smoke, pale and ghastly. The crowd hushed and then roared, surging to their feet. Zack stood with everyone else. I followed a split second later. He wasn't cheering. He glared at the witch with white braids and white tourney suit like she was the devil. For him it was personal. "Why are you here? You're going to die," he hissed, his blue eyes burning with a little too much fanaticism. I'd gotten to watch up close and personal my friend's descent into Pitch obsession along with half of Dayside. At least half. Pitch's tourneys had been selling out for years. Zack had dragged me to one of the first ones when I didn't care about anything other than ripping apart the world. He put a lot of effort into bringing me back to myself after I got swallowed by Darkside. I waved a hand. "It's so dramatic. It would be better with music." He elbowed my chest. Nothing was better than whatever Pitch did, and if she didn't do music, then neither should anyone else. Lit did a few elaborate moves that showed how graceful and astonishing she was, with seriously high-quality hurters that made my eyes burn. Before she was finished, a high keening grew above the level of sound, growing and growing until I couldn't help the goosebumps on my arms. Screams shattered the air, darkness covering the field and lit up like a blanket of death and destruction had fallen. Was more like it. Pitch was coming from the sky, and when she hit, the fun would begin. The fans screamed in ecstasy, so you could barely hear the screams of terror she brought with her. Altogether, it was a horrible, awesome, amazing sound that no one living could ignore. Pitch was like that, no matter how numb when you got there. By the time you left, you were buzzing, filled with emotions whether you wanted them or not. Zack didn't scream, but his whole body was stretched and taut, searching the darkness for the figure of the falling witch. Everyone knew that she came down too hard for a flying witch, like she didn't suspend gravity at all, just broke her legs every time she landed. She defied the laws of physics and magic. I didn't go to all the tourneys anymore. I didn't need them to help me feel and connect to Dayside. It felt somewhat indecent to stand next to Zack and watch him watch her. Rather to look at her when he was looking at her like she had his heart made me uncomfortable. Who wasn't attracted to a witch who could fight like that? She moved with lethal grace that defied any mage's ability to resist, but in my mind, she belonged to Zachary Stoneborough. I couldn't look at her and want her, and being a mage who liked witches. It was impossible to look at Pitch and not want her. When the flickering darkness broke apart enough to see the cloaked figure, I nodded. Excellent presentation. What would the witch beneath the rubber-encased steel suit be like? If Zack could ever get to her, he would seduce her with his family name, his wealth, his tech, and if that didn't work, his heart bleeding at her feet. Pitch didn't collect hearts. She collected brilliant new tech. That was part of why Zack was smitten. His family developed the greatest tech in Day and Darkside. Pitch's gear and hurters were always a cutting edge past what his family did. It drove him insane, trying to figure out how she did what she did, how she got her suits to behave like an organic piece of machinery instead of cold rubber and steel. "Who are we supposed to be cheering for again?" I asked, just to be irritating. He didn't look at me or even elbow me. He was lost in the flickering shadows of the most lethal witch in our world. She spun around and threw something at Lit Up, hitting her hard, repeatedly, black explosions that should have been light. But that was Pitch, sucking the light out of the world and leaving only darkness behind. Who didn't love darkness? Kill her, Zack screamed, his soul in that drawn-out cry. Did she hear him? Did she look up and smile at him? That's what it looked like. Another nail in the coffin of his obsession. The tourney was over soon after that. It was like she forgot that this was a performance and wanted Lit's blood. The witch screamed in Pitch's hands, ripped apart by the explosive balls, the hurters that Pitch hurled at massive speeds, volley after volley until she was on her, witch against witch. When Lit went out, Pitch kept pounding on her until the other players came out on the field to stop her. Most of them went down as soon as they got in range. Pitch had officially lost it. He was sight, vaulted over the rail and hit the ground, running towards his true love. I didn't follow him. She was going to hurt him, and he'd love it. Well, I did not need a wound from any witch. Zack wasn't the only one who ran onto the field. In a few minutes, only a few people were left in the stands. Down below, it was a surging mass of violence and not quite bloodshed. I lost sight of Zack until a flare of blue showed me his position, close to Pitch. He'd pushed back the opponents so she could kill Lit Up at her own leisure. I didn't get the idea that Pitch would appreciate any interference, no matter how much it helped her. She didn't need anyone, but the crowd wanted a piece of her, and it was their turn to rip her apart. The audience heaved and tangled around until I saw Zack grab Pitch's arm, using his best spells to rip open a path for their escape. Of course, he'd escape with her. She looked at him, black eyes and a white face, black lips pursed as if considering implications. Then she smashed a bottle on him, knocked him out, and then ran down that blue corridor he'd cleared for her out of the tourney field and into the darkness. I waited until the crowd had thinned a bit to levitate over the crowd and drop down next to Zack, where he was still lying on the field, ignoring the fact that he was being trampled. I expected him to be unconscious, but he stared into the sky with a look of utter bliss on his face. He had a hand on his wrist, and his blood was everywhere. She'd cut him deep. I grabbed him and stepped through side, ripping a hole between the twin dimensions of day and dark side, then went right back into day side, our world, where humanity mingled with the sorcerers and mages that originated in dark side. Outsiders like Zack and I could visit dark side, but it was difficult to live in the toxic land filled with chaotic magic. It is like Zack and I could visit dark side, but it was difficult to live in the toxic land filled with chaotic magic. I came back in my Rosewood dorm and dumped him on the black couch. "I'll get someone to heal you," I said. Zack shook his head and smiled his mad, obsessed, stupid smile. "She cut me. Did you see it?" She smiled at me twice and cut me. "She wants me." "You have to get the cut healed. Your feelings will make the wound a binding. You can't be bound to a witch you don't know. Ian and Whitley, Zack. Ian and Whitley. Do you need another example of how bad an idea this is?" He flashed me another grin with his blue eyes flickering with energy and madness. The dark side was strong with him. Pitch isn't wit. How could you compare the two? It doesn't matter. You don't bind yourself to someone who doesn't know you. Wit has to touch Ian or he goes insane. Do you think that Pitch is going to be fine with you showing up, demanding that she touch you? No. You'll be pathetic. Witches hate pathetic mages. Be the Ian before Wit, not after. There was no Ian before Wit. They are the definition of codependent. Exactly. Zack, let me heal you. He snarled at me in my face, all feral and dangerous. I will never stop loving her. I am bound to her as long as my heart will beat. I felt the binding as he spoke the words, sealing himself to a witch who probably didn't know that he existed. It was utterly stupid, and yet Zack was from the second wealthiest family in Dayside. He was an elite of the elite. If she cared about that at all, if she cared about anything he had to offer, he would slither his way into her heart until she was as addicted to him as he was to her. It didn't sound healthy, but love between a witch and a mage never was. Sorcerers and sorceresses probably had it worse. They had skill to go with their high levels of dark side magic. A Daysider was a dark side with human blood that cut the potency of the magic and the intensity of the madness that came from dark side. That was September. The month Zack gave his heart and tied his soul to Pitch, at the same time that Pitch disappeared from the world. Chapter 2. She's gone. Zach's voice was as empty and anemic as a voice could be and still carry sound. The patheticness of that sound made my skin itch. I was sitting in the lab, working on a compound that would create just the right amount of green smoke and sparks during my upcoming tourney. I was starting. The seniors had let me start a few times a season the last 2 years, but now, a junior, I owned the tourney. It was something to do, something to keep the burning at bay. I was going to win, slaughter whoever I was up against. I always did. That's what you said. He shook his head. Her herder maker. I was going to track his shop and torture him until he told me where to find Pitch. Respect for a professional be damned, but he hasn't touched his shop since the tourney. He's back-ordered for months, years. The orders just keep pouring in after that last tourney on those dark explosives. How did he do that? But there's no sign of him, no sign of Pitch, nothing. She's not registered for any more tourneys. Lit's gone as well, isn't she? He curled his lip at me. Yes, she knows I'm her enemy, but I might have been able to torture something out of her. His snarl faded, and he was left slumped down on the counter next to me, staring out the window at the rain pouring down. Are you going to blow off the upcoming tourney? I asked. He was making a habit of it. He twitched, all the energy he had for a shrug. What's the point? I turned to face him, looking him up and down. He hadn't changed his clothes in a week, or showered, or moved. He'd probably disappear into his room again and not be seen for another few weeks. Do you think that she's in Darkside? He sighed. I don't know. You've asked your mercenaries, haven't you? I nodded. My Darksiders aren't exactly aware of the up-and-coming Dayside tourney stars. She's only been playing for 5 years. Has it been such a short time? What was the world without Pitch playing? I winced, nauseating. Are you really going to sit and wax eloquent about her before I've had dinner? You'll put off my appetite. Look, I love witches, adore the sweet little diabolical creatures, but binding yourself to one was so much stupider than you should be, the genius heir of the Stoneborough legacy. Throwing your life away for a female you've never talked to. He sat up and scowled at me. I don't have to talk to her to know her mind, her heart, her soul. The tech, the combination of skill and assets, the way she uses everything unlike any other born witch, she's worth throwing my life away for. He got up and stalked out, half energetic for a change. I watched him leave the lab, his hand gripping his wrist where she'd cut him to the bone, the heart, the soul. All this talk about souls was making me angry. I cleaned up my mess and headed to the dining room. I stood in line behind a pair of girls who kept glancing back at me and giggling. I haven't seen Stoneborough for ages. A woman's low voice came from behind me. Whitley had been a girl when she was younger, much younger, but overnight you couldn't call her that, couldn't think of her like that. Femme fatale, yes. Girl, no. It all happened after she came back from her trip to Darkside. Darkside ruined all of us. I didn't turn to look at her. That would only encourage her. Were you looking for him? I'll let him know to keep a low profile. She laughed, but it ended abruptly. I heard that Pitch cut him. Did it? I glanced over my shoulder at the most diabolical witch I knew, masses of dark hair surrounding the perfect face and blistering blue eyes. Why are you here? I thought you were gone for good at the French school. La Frère Demonique is a good place, but my heart belongs to Rosewood. As though you have a heart. Anger burned in my chest. Whitley, the raven-haired, blue-eyed, epically beautiful, talented, diabolical witch, had single-handedly destroyed one of my favorite mages, one of the 3 of us who I'd led into Darkside and brought back ruined. He didn't need her to rip him apart. He had a dragon for that. She put her hand over her left breast, drawing my attention in spite of myself. Her proportions were perfection, like everything about her other than her vicious cruelty. To be fair, she was perfect at vicious cruelty as well. She enjoyed ripping apart mages and exploited weakness like no other. That was fine, expected, but Eon's weakness for her was so pathetic. She should have felt some pity from her Dayside, human nature. Her pout was mocking. You wound me, we're performing together for the extravaganza. Conti partiro. I scowled at her. No, we aren't. You object to my voice? My scowl darkened. No one could object to Whitley's voice, looks, skills, or ranking, but she was still the one who had destroyed my friend's sanity, like Pitch was doing to Zach, but at least Pitch hadn't asked for Zach's heart. Her smile grew more delighted. You look truly upset. Tell me that it has something to do with me. Has Ian done something idiotic that you had to rescue him from, and all because of his relentless love for me? Her eyes flashed when she said, "Love's because of course love was ridiculous for any mage to claim, particularly when that mage was busy seducing a world of witches. Still he did love her, or she wouldn't have his heart and soul in her grasping hand. Grasping. No matter how much she had, she always wanted more. She should be satisfied with the pain she'd put him through and let it rest, not come back here to torment him again. He's in Darkside. He won't come back if you're here." She laughed and looked up at me through her dark lashes. "You're so good to your fellow mages. Poor Ian chased away by the wicked witch. I know where he is. He's sleeping his way through the ranks of the Krieg as we speak." I use the term sleeping lightly. If Zach's bound to pitch, he'll grow mad without her, desolate, desperate. You should attach him to a witch. I looked at her in horror and revulsion that I didn't try to fight, and that's you. She laughed again, amused by my reaction to her. "Stoneborough is nothing to me. I am content to let it remain that way. No, choose one of your little adoring fans. Vinnie comes to mind. She's respectable." "I'm surprised you can recognize respectability in anyone. It's a trait so far from your own tendencies." She sighed heavily, her breasts rising and falling beneath the thin white blouse. Such a double standard. Ian isn't respectable. Even you must see that, and we're a matched set. He ruins witches, I ruin him. And other mages. She shrugged. Only in moderation. Whitley, a senior said, coming to stand behind her. Taylor was large, wealthy, talented, and charming. The way he looked at her was hungry, the way he hovered over her possessive. Her eyes narrowed, and I got to see that flash of calculating coldness before she smiled and turned to glance at him over her shoulder. Would she play with him? Was he worthy of her in terms of wealth and rank? I faced forward, trying to forget her words. Bromium, magnesium, silicates. So October passed, and the matron insisted that I sing with Whitley, a duet to rival all other duets. The worst thing about singing with Whitley, or doing anything with her, was the guilt. She belonged to Ian, like Pitch belonged to Zach, and wanting either female was out of the question. Whitley's body, face, voice were all designed to ensnare a mage, like her mother, a seduction witch of the highest caliber. My awareness of her was out of my control, even though I would never act on it. She knew that I held myself away from her out of loyalty to Ian, and thought that was hilarious. That's why she wore sheer blouses or tight skirts and looked at me while we sang like she was in love with me. After every practice, I left as soon as possible, shuddering to shake the traces of seduction witch off me. She didn't try with other mages because it would be too easy. She was as bored with mages as I was with witches, except for Ian. I ran into him in the hall one afternoon, drunk and angry. "Have you seen Whit?" he asked in a dangerous voice. "No, of course not. I never see her." "You're singing together." "Did she tell you that?" He laughed, throwing back his head before he pulled out a cask and took a deep drink. "You should sleep with her again. Your resistance is the only thing she finds appealing about you, and making you jealous." He shrugged and started walking towards her room. "How long can you go without touching her?" He shot me a scowl. "Why do you want to know? Are you considering being bound to a witch? I highly recommend it. How else could you achieve the ultimate highs and lows of complete desperation before the next fix? Zach and Pitch." He growled. "Idiot, you're still taking interest in Stoneborough. I suppose that's rational. Business always was your true love. How deep is the bond? My bond to Whit isn't as strong as it could be if she'd wanted it." I studied him. She didn't want it. "No, I manipulated her into it. Seduced her. If you want to get technical, I must be a complete idiot. You always were about her, even before she had your bond. How long? A few weeks, a month. Maybe 2 if you want to be a raving lunatic." He held up a palm horizontally to the floor, and I got to watch it tremble. "It's been 5 weeks. How is he doing?" I shrugged. "Not well. He stays in his room, misses most classes, doesn't eat in the dining room, doesn't even show up for tourneys to beat the crap out of anyone." That doesn't sound like Stoneborough. "Is he working on tech?" I shrugged. "What else would he do?" "Stare at her poster and drool. Can you find her?" Have you looked?" I shook my head. What would I say if I found her? "Come and touch my friend, he's obsessed with you." She'd cut off my head. I'd offer to look for you, but I'd probably try to seduce her. Maybe she could diminish the craving longer than most. The craving for wit or witches in general. The smile was sickly. Wit is the only one I've had that diminishes the dragon's craving, and no one else can dim my desire for her. I'm surprised that you aren't still dating her. She is perfection. I winced. I hadn't exactly dated her, but explaining what I was doing with her wouldn't be any better for either of us. Perfect for you is not perfect for me. Where would I begin searching for pitch? Do you have her scent? Her hurters smell like black cherry and licorice, but I haven't been close enough to catch her skin. He frowned and walked a bit faster. Pity, if I run into anything among the creed, I'll let you know. He broke into a run, completely losing any pretension at indifference as he raced to his cruel mistress. It was disgusting. I wouldn't ever fall to a witch the way my two best friends had fallen. Ian used to have potential, limitless really. He was the most talented mage I'd met before Darkside and then wit. His magic came in earlier than most, and he had an innate gift with spellcraft, but now he did nothing other than bed witches. He and Wit had been the ultimate power couple before. Well, even I had to admit that he screwed her over, or screwed half the school when she'd been in Darkside, but she shouldn't have gone without him. He never would have gone anywhere without her. Her ambitions destroyed them as much as his own inner dragon. An older mage bumped into me coming around a corner. I smiled at him, and green blinding rage ripped through me, and I ripped through him, feeling relief every time my fist impacted his bones. Oscar and Pete were holding me back when I blinked the hall back into focus. The senior was on the floor, eyes closed, chest rising and falling faintly. I'd left deep gouges in his body, wounds that would turn septic very quickly if I didn't take him down to the hospital. I shrugged off the mages who I'd sent to the hospital once or twice. "I'm fine, take him." "Convenient you have such a big car," Pete said with a manic smile. His smile didn't touch his dead eyes. "Move now." I pulled out my phone and had another student bringing my car to the nearest entrance. I could have taken care of it myself, but I had hunting in Darkside to do. Chapter 3. November. With eyes like emeralds of forgotten dreams. The love in my heart for you it screams. It wasn't the terribleness of the poem that failed to hold my attention, but the sight of Zachary Stoneborough shuffling down the side alley between buildings that distracted me from the awfulness of the poem. Ira or Vera, or whatever her name was, wrote the worst poetry about me that I'd ever heard, and I'd heard a lot. I took the slip of paper out of her fingers and left the blonde, heading towards Zachary. He'd gone into the Marge gymnasium, which was empty this time of day. I caught up to him easily because he really wasn't trying. Ropes hung from the ceiling, and swords lined the walls. "Stoneborough," I drawled, slinging my arm around his shoulders. He looked even more gaunt and miserable up close. "I have a poem of epic awfulness to share with you. I can't think of anyone who would appreciate it more than you." He didn't respond, didn't shove me off him, didn't seem to notice me. One thing I always was noticed. I stepped in front of him, blocking his way, then stepping to the side when he slowly tried to work around me. "Rake, your lips like gloves of love, coated in luminous love." She didn't notice that she used that word twice. She could have said luminous glove if she was following the meter, or just gone for a different word. What rhymes with love? "Drake, your lips, like gloves of love, will be coated in blood when I shove." He narrowed his eyes, but he didn't push me, didn't even try. I scoffed. "That was terrible. You're supposed to be the great linguist. You must be spending all your brilliance writing poetry to the enchanting tourney star. If only you knew where to send it." He didn't shove me. He threw himself on me, knocking me down and rolling me a few times before he pulled back and punched. I had such a beautiful face. It was a pity to mar it, but it was such a relief to see something in Zach's ever-dulling eyes that I'd allow it. He punched me until he rolled off and stalked away, a little more lively than he'd been. But the rage was quickly fading. I took the hair I'd borrowed and wove a quick tracking spell once he'd left the building. I followed his trail, back outside, across the alley, down a broad hall to the library, up the steps and to the desk where Oscar Lovecraft waited with a bored look, reading a treatise on interdimensional relations. He was such a smart mage, and vicious too. "Oscar," I said, leaning against the desk and smiling. His shoulders rose slightly, preparing for an attack or something even worse and more unexpected. "Drake, are you looking for a book?" "Me? No, not unless Zack was looking for a book, in which case I'm looking for the same one." "What a coincidence, right?" He nodded to a far table where the enormous figure of Lester crouched over a table piled high with books. The Maj wasn't particularly clean or attractive, and he had an extra £100 or so. He visited with Lester before he asked me if the school had anything by Horwitz. Horwitz the Forbidden. Horwitz the Mad, Horwitz the Mage, who ended up turning himself into lava in the most bizarre and painful suicide possible. "We don't," Oscar said with a shrug and went back to reading. It was almost as though I wasn't worth noticing. Should I smash his head against the desk? No, it was such a nice desk. I ambled over to Lester. He stood up as soon as I got within warding distance. He had a confused frown, like he wasn't sure if this was a challenge or a tea party. He had a lot of dark side blood in him. It made him easily confused. I pulled out the chair across from him and put my feet up on the table. My shoes were perfectly polished, the cognac leather going beautifully with my calculatedly mussed hair. Stoneborough has recently visited. Tell me what he wanted, and I'll be ever so grateful. He blinked at me with those big, stupid eyes, trying to process this situation. He's trying to find tracking spells to follow love. He's been using his own blood, a lot of it. He wanted to know if I had any ideas about how he could make his blood more potent. I don't think he lacks potency. It's more likely that the person in question is unfindable without more direct methods. He frowned and slowly sat back down, still eyeing me uncertainly. I rose, slapping his shoulder and grinning at him. "How helpful you are. Strange you didn't mention Horwitz the Mad. It's like you weren't trying to be helpful." His low brow went lower over those dull eyes. "Horwitz did some interesting work on regeneration. I could have mentioned it to him, but his work is difficult to find, and even more difficult to parse. So much is irrelevant or willfully obtuse." "Ah, like you. I see why you relate. How much did he give you?" He reached in his pocket and pulled out a vial filled with rare metal filings. "I'm interested in organic compounds, not tech, but he seemed out of sorts, so I took it. You can give it back to him if you'd like." I gave him a sharp smile. "Those are for selling. That's a good $50,000 in there. Do you know how to sell things for money? Money is what we use to get things we want in this world." He blinked slowly and looked more puzzled. He was buying information. I didn't tell him anything concrete he can do. Why pay for what wasn't sold? This is a school. The price of admission includes the knowledge within. His expression brightened. "I can pay for next year's tuition with these filings, and next year he can ask me another question." He nodded like that made things more clear, then tucked the vial away and opened a book. I slapped it closed and smiled while I perched on the edge of the table over him. "Lester, I adore the way you make sense of the world. So few people do. What did you tell Zachary Stoneborough that he can do to track down Pitch Black?" He stared at me. "Pitch Black, isn't she?" He frowned deeply, trying to remember something that didn't apply to his biological experiments. "Tourney star, Zach's obsession. He's trying to find her. If he does find her, she'll kill him. If he doesn't find her, he'll go mad. He's supposed to be this genius, but he fell for the absolute worst woman." A seductive laugh went through the room, getting even Lester's attention. "All right, the second worst woman." Whitley sat down at the table and smiled seductively at Lester. She put a hand on his arm and batted her lashes at him. "Is the wicked mage tormenting you? You wouldn't even notice." How delightful. She turned to me and then raised a brow when she saw the sheet of poetry I still carried. "Loves of love. The witch needs to be burned for that. Will you burn her? She'll be delighted, I'm sure." Lester stumbled away from her, knocking the chair over in his haste. He didn't say anything, just turned and retreated as fast as he could, clumsy ox of a beast that he was. I scowled at her. "You scared him away." She beamed at me with her bright teeth. "Isn't he fun? What are you going to do about Stoneburrow? Why would you care? She cocked her head and pouted. Oh, Drake, don't you know me at all? I care about one thing, status quo. Stoneburrow is one of the families in my circle. That means I care. I don't want Zachary crushed, or I would have done it already. I resent that nonentity, pitch black, sending ripples through my idyllic social life. I grunted. She was lying. She was always lying. Even when she was being earnest, she was lying. I'm sure he'd appreciate your concern. Her eyes narrowed. He's going to get self-destructive. If he doesn't have someone to stop him, he'll... Her eyes grew round and shocked. Do the unthinkable, she whispered before giving me a biting smile and stood. She adjusted her skirt and smoothed down her top, giving me the chance to notice how perfect she was before she turned and waltzed off. I hated suicide. I hated Whit almost as much as I hated suicide. Whitley putting her hand on Lester was a segue into violence. He'd acted wisely in running instead of engaging. Still, what was wrong with him, not rising to the challenge that was Whitley Penmore? He lacked spirit. He also lacked an appreciation for women. Lucky Lester. Chapter 4. December. Snow flurried across the brightly lit green around the enormous Christmas tree. Kids laughed and chatted, full of bright spirit since most of the tests were completed, and with the holidays coming, they'd get to go home. I'd go home to Huntsman Manor and boss around the housekeeper and the butler. There were parties and I could crash at anyone's house if I wanted, but everything would be so boring. I'd probably spend the whole time in Darkside, filling out a huntsman army that needed to be home for Christmas. People should be home for Christmas if they had a home, and not just a big box of a mansion. Oh yes, poor Drake Huntsman, too wealthy in money and poor in love. I should tell that to the blonde sophomore in her ugly knit cap. She looked like the kind of girl who would buy a sob story. She probably had cats too. She might think that I was sincere. I shuddered and turned away. What's that? Is someone climbing the tree? A guy asked. And the murmuring rose behind me, and I turned to see who was the idiot climbing the enormous Christmas tree, in the middle of the green decorated with elaborate spun glass balls and lights, the balls bursting with sparkles inside of them. It was quite beautiful if you liked that kind of thing. Yes, someone was climbing the tree like an idiot. It would fall down on him and probably break a few bones. I smiled slightly and edged towards the tree. There was nothing like watching an idiot to make me feel better about myself, except that the Christmas tree was spelled to stay upright. I frowned as I watched the scrawny figure scale it. It was also spelled to keep people from climbing up it. Otherwise, I'd be the one climbing and getting all the attention. Everyone knew that I was the best climber in school. But it would take particularly hard work to climb the Christmas tree, since you'd have to be unraveling the protection spells the whole way. Now I was interested. Those spells should be much too complex for any of my contemporaries to undo. I squinted and zeroed in on the mage. Even in the dark, I could see the gaunt face, the determined, hopeless eyes. I knew that look and hated it more than anything else. Zachary Stoneburrow was out of his mind with desperation. Is that Stoneburrow? What is he doing? The ugly knit cap girl asked, voice laced with laughter. I haven't seen him all semester. I thought he dropped out. A guy said that. Camera raised to record the show. Dropped is right, or at least it will be. The breathy voice behind my shoulder made my skin prickle. Whitley shouldn't be here, or anywhere, or even exist. What do you want? She laughed, but there was an undercurrent of rage that made me want to summon a sword. I want to watch the performance. What will you do when you realize that it's too late to save him? You have such a magnificent temper, and you make certain it's worth watching. I scowled at her before turning to face the tree. I can't save him from his own idiocy. Don't you have a limo to get to? Driving me, but he got distracted on the way, at least I imagine. I should get a pretty leash for him, something nice and golden to go with his eyes. It's brilliant, really. The protection spells created a sort of null beneath them. He might actually succeed. I glanced at her again, and she was staring at the tree, at the mage who was almost to the top. I turned and frowned, muttering so I could see the trail of magic and spells wrapped around the Christmas tree and the mage. Zack's protection was gone. All 50 layers of carefully crafted mage work had nullified beneath the tree spells, just like Wit had said. Zack pulled out a rope and started tying it to the highest branch that would hold his weight. I cursed and started for the tree at a jog. I muttered spells as I ran. My spell work was deplorable, a fact I was usually proud of because I was Drake Huntsman and could buy spells if I wanted them. But this was a time that I'd need talent and skill or something even stronger. I ran faster and faster as they looped the rope around his neck, tugged tight, and took a deep breath. He raised his arm, kissed the thick scar over his wrist, and then jumped at the same moment that I hit the tree. I used a lot more than spells and magecraft. I used the raw power I'd gotten infected with the first time I'd gone to dark side and come back more than mage, more like monster. The impact from me, my magic, and the tree shattered my collarbone in a flash of green. It also broke the spells holding the tree up. It fell, a much higher fall than Zack had wanted, but also breaking the null and the vulnerability that would have given Zack an out, a death, a suicide. I hated suicide. Green clouded my vision, along with a flurry of actual green branches, piercing the air with a pungent scent of pine sap. I ripped apart branches as I made my way through the shattered glass bulbs with their golden sparkles trailing over the evergreen branches. It was a beautiful chaos, green, gold, the colors of rosewood and me. When I finally reached the mage with a rope around his throat, he snarled at me, furious that I'd taken away his escape. I kicked him, knocking that snarl off his face, striking and thrashing the idiot mage while my collarbone distantly throbbed. Things snapped and cracked, necessary things, while my claws ripped through flesh and bone. "Drake, you're going to kill him," Ian hissed, grabbing my shoulder and sinking his own burning claws into me, sending a bolt of fire through my bones. I blinked the world back into focus. Zack was grinning now, blood staining his broken teeth, eyes bright and utterly insane. That's when I realized that he'd set me up. The little monster had set me up to kill him if the Christmas tree didn't do it. I very nearly did kill him then, but Ian was as strong as I was, and a dozen other students were on me the next instant, hauling me away from Zachary Stoneborough, where he lay laughing so hard that tears burned in his eyes, unless it wasn't the laughter or something so much worse. What could I do to save him? What could anyone do? I'm waiting. Its voice was vaguely amused because she'd enjoyed watching the show as much as she'd said she would. What a show, watching me become lost in rage, destroying the one I'd broken my collarbone trying to save. Yes, wasn't I good entertainment? And caught my eye, his sparking gold, because his mistress had called. "Have you got it under control?" I nodded and shoved my hair out of my eyes, noticing the blood on my hands that would go so well with my hair. It would blend in almost naturally. "I'm good. You'd better run along and not keep Penmore waiting." He studied me for an extra second before he nodded, sending golden curls over his forehead before he turned, jogging towards the woman who owned him, the one who would torture him just short of him killing himself. They'd been playing that game for years. What had Wit said about finding someone to bind Zack to, a binding that would help him with his unrequited love? What did she know about it? It was probably impossible, pointless, but what else did I have to worry about over Christmas break, other than breaking Zack again? Chapter 5. Pinhouse was spending the holiday at the cottage in southern France, because nothing said winter holiday better than a medium-sized castle surrounded by a moat meticulously landscaped with evergreen shrubs. The sky was overcast, clouds scudding along like they did, while I stood at the end of the drive that went over the grey lake to the four-turreted stone fortress that one of Vinodraw's forebears had built, or conquered, or something. Vineldra Pinhouse was one of the least diabolical witches I knew, and she came with a pedigree even more meticulous than mine. But I knew that she would help me because she was desperately in love with me. It wasn't my stunning red hair, or even more stunning green eyes that had snared her. But the monster that bubbled under my skin, the same kind that Ian and Teddy Prince had, she couldn't help it any more than any of the other witches could help wanting me, and I was going to take full advantage of her weakness. A mage appeared in front of me, wearing a tux and tails. He was tall, lean, completely different from Vinaldra's proportions. "May I ask who's calling?" he asked with dark eyes that burned with malevolence. The butler/bodyguard had an excellent ominous presence. No doubt it cost extra. "Drake Huntsman. I'm here to see my fellow school chum, Vinaldra. I'd heard that she was in residence here, having left school early before I could speak to her about a most pressing matter." His eyes burned. "How inconvenient that you couldn't call or send a message through email or text, or any number of other ways the younger generation seems so adept at communicating." I cleared my throat and straightened my jacket. I'd worn an extremely respectable suit that was mostly business, but with a dash of money just because I was huntsman, and I could. But then I wouldn't have gotten a chance to see the excellent statuary. I gestured at the sculptures of hideous dragons or gargoyles, or whatever they were, that lined a drive. Vinny has waxed eloquent about her statuary for absolutely days and days, years and years, eons and eons. With a snick and the feeling of all the oxygen being sucked out of my lungs, I was pulled into the cottage and dropped in front of a fireplace even larger and more pointless than the ones in Huntsman proper. "Now that is a mantel," I said, nodding at the hulking piece of marble jutting out of the elaborately carved stone. "Drake Huntsman, what are you doing here?" Viney's voice squeaked, but she tried to maintain her affront at being approached so indelicately. Barging in on a family occasion should embarrass me terribly, but I'd have to care about any of the adults who ran Dayside, and I didn't. I turned a stunning smile on the short female with spiked dark hair. She'd started dyeing it years ago, as if she wanted to shake off her pasty family and join the Blackhearts, who were almost universally the sallow-skinned, black-eyed, and haired witches and mages that took their coloring from Darkside. "I have a favor to ask." A woman stepped forward, eyes glinting chips of dark gray stone beneath a fluffy chiffon of palaced lemon meringue. Her hair made me hungry. Maybe after this I would go to Huntsman Manor and indulge my sweet tooth, if I still had one of those. "Mr. Huntsman, what a pleasant surprise. What favor do you ask of my daughter?" Madame Pinhouse was a terror. Everyone knew that, but no one could tell you exactly why. It's as though she manipulated the world so cleverly, no one saw her doing it. "It's a business proposition, naturally. It is a bit delicate, and I haven't broached the topic with your charming child, so lost was I in the heady idea of working so closely with a member of your elevated family." She blinked, breaking that hard stare for a moment. "Your words are from another time and place. You spend a lot of time in Darkside. That is no place for a respectable witch or mage." I flashed a smile at her. "I never said I was respectable. However, I do have a business deal to offer your daughter." "Mom, he's Huntsman. What do you think he's going to do to me?" Vinny grabbed my arm and dragged me out of the monstrously grand parlor or ballroom, or whatever the room with an excessive number of ornate gilded mirrors and uncomfortable-looking chairs was. I looked dashing in the mirrors, tall and lean, allowing the short witch to remove my person from the presence of her mother. Was I speaking archaically? Probably. Did I care? Not remotely. Archaic thoughts fit the architecture. When we got to a narrow corridor, she cast a privacy spell that would keep what we said in and others out. "What business deal?" She raised her sharp chin and glared at me, but her hand was still clinging tenaciously to my jacket. I cleared my throat and subtly disengaged from her grasp. "I need you to verify something that Whitley mentioned. You and I know how trustworthy she is, but at the same time, who is as experienced at keeping a mage as her?" She stared at me, almost hungrily. "That witch. What did she say?" "Bindings. She mentioned that it was possible to get another binding that diminished the first. Have you not heard about Zach's recent escapade with the Christmas tree?" She scowled and pulled out her phone. A few seconds later, she was speeding through the video. I heard the tinny crash and then my excellent voice yelling shockingly inelegant curses at the mage. She looked up at me with her eyes large and confused. What was he doing? It's not self-evident. He's gotten himself attached to Pitch. And she's disappeared. She took a step towards me and grabbed my coat sleeve again. I patted her hand instead of pushing her away. That's right. What do you know about bindings? Do you know anything at all? I'm not sure why I thought you would, but when it comes to eligible maidens, you and Whitley are matched. What can you tell me about bindings? I breathed in her face, watching her eyes grow more and more heavy with the allure she couldn't resist, and didn't bother to try. She leaned against me, lids heavy. I heard something about that. Multiple bindings diminish the strength of the first if there is an absentee, but I don't know any particulars. You can always experiment and see if it works. There shouldn't be any negative side effects other than blood loss. I smiled my most devastating smile at her and then stepped back, holding onto her shoulders so she wouldn't fall over. You've been remarkably helpful. I'll send Jasper to work out the details of payment. I'm off to find a witch to bind to the idiot. I don't suppose you could recommend anyone. No, of course I've taken too much of your valuable time already. Thank you, Vinildra. You're a gem. I winked at her and turned away, but there she was, grabbing my coat sleeve again. She'd written me a poem about them. She was a much better poet than most of my ardent admirers. She should teach them classes in Drake Huntsman obsession. I'll do it. I'll help you if you want me to. She wanted me to want her so much, but I didn't. I couldn't have a 5-sentence conversation with her before she was reduced to grunts and slavering. It wasn't her fault that she was smitten with me, but it was annoying, except when it was useful. I paused and glanced at her, slightly confused. Help me? Oh no, I don't need a binding. It's Zack who needs a binding with a very stable witch who won't take advantage of his vulnerability. There will have to be a very rigorous contract. Imagine falling prey to a vicious creature like Pitch who could rip you apart so beautifully, but didn't even know that you existed. It's tragic. She rolled her eyes and then scowled at me. I'll bind to Stoneborough with a contract if you want me to. She was much preferable with eyes shooting daggers at me than mouth drooling. Are you sure? It seems like something that would be quite far beneath you. You're pinhouse masters of I'm not sure what you do, to be honest, mostly running countries, isn't it? Stoneborough would make an ideal ally. I'm sure your Jasper can come up with a suitable contract. When do you need me to perform the binding? Now, or will after Christmas break suffice? I smiled and leaned close to her, exhaling slowly so her eyes went blurry and unfocused. Tomorrow, if that's not too soon. She ran her hands over my chest, while her own rose and fell as she hyperventilated. My room isn't very far from here. I believe that you enjoy a good time as well as the next mage. I sneered and removed her hands before stepping back, comparing me to the next mage. How appalling! I'm far worse than any other mage you could possibly know, and that includes Ian. She flinched. She'd spent a lot of time with Ian and made sure that I noticed. Whitley was much more interested in the two than I was, but Viney had survived it, if barely. There's also the fact that your mother would behead me if I were to meddle with a witch with such a formidable reputation as yourself. Not that I mind a good beheading, but it would throw off the lines of this suit. Don't you agree? She nodded along with me before she glared down at her black boots that looked so graceless compared to her family and heritage. Sure. Do you want anything else? She couldn't help looking up hopefully. If she wasn't so mindlessly obsessed, I'd have less of a problem dating her seriously, although when was I ever serious about anything involving witches? I had far too many excellent examples of why that was such a bad idea, the worst idea, the most impossible idea a mage could have. I believe that's all for now. I'll have Jasper fetch you. Oh, I should probably have your number in case I need something. Her eyes brightened, even though she struggled to contain her bliss. Sure. After I got her number, I walked towards her, stepping through sides so I came out on top of a hill overlooking a ruined city, overgrown by sentient trees that smelled like rotting potatoes. I'd gotten close enough to know that they weren't potatoes as much as human flesh, but I tried not to dwell on it. Old Scythe was what it had been called when it was still habitable. Wild magic had wrecked it even more than most of Darkside was affected, leaving it a good place to come and contemplate death and other things. Ian didn't come here when he wanted to socialize, so I probably shouldn't bother him, but I'd need his help if I was going to get Zack to go along with this mess. I sauntered over to the pile of rubble where Ian sat, cross-legged, slumped, a bottle in his fist as he stared at the wreckage that his parents had died trying to protect or salvage or something. I sat next to him, shifting so that the rocks didn't dig in too uncomfortably. He passed the bottle over but didn't look at me. His hair had a good cut, short in the side and longer on top, with excellent texture. It looked and smelled like Whitley. She liked to cut his hair when she wanted him to feel like her poodle. Here he was, feeling like her poodle. "How are things?" I asked, even though it was quite apparent by the look on his face exactly how things were. "Lovely. Thank you for asking. And you?" His mocking tone was worlds better than Zach's lifeless one. "I will find a way to get her to release you. You won't be in her clutches forever." I took a nice long draw of the liquor that wasn't as revolting as usual. It was pleasantly spiced, with a base of cranberries and a hint of pine. "You didn't come here to talk about that." I lowered the bottle and frowned at it. If he was drinking something that reminded him of family, of Christmas at home before his parents had gotten themselves exploded, he'd really resent the intrusion. "No, I didn't. I'm getting Vinny to bind Zach, but I'll need your help with a compulsion. Zach's not going to agree to it, so I have him unconscious in the hospital. I want you to do a small glamour on Vinny, give her a bit of pitch, and then voila, the binding should take. You want me to use seduction magic to turn her into an object of his lust, and Pinhouse agreed to that. I suppose she would. Her obsession with you seems to have a basis on some small actual interest. I suppose there are some small points that might interest a female if she was desperate enough." That was him not mentioning the fact that I dated Whitley. I wanted to grind my teeth. It was one date, and while memorable, was certainly nothing I'd ever choose to repeat. I slapped him on the back. "You flatter me too much. I'm already notoriously egotistical. No need to encourage my natural propensities. Will you do it?" He shrugged elegantly. He was such an elegant, womanizing slut. I might as well. I'm not sure if you know, but Viney finds me particularly despicable. Doing a little lust spell on the two of them will be quite amusing. I could stand being amused. "What did she do to you?" He smiled and looked at me for the first time. Fire burned in his golden eyes, fire that he had to keep on a tight leash. "It isn't me what's doing it too. That's all. She's with someone else instead of me, but she made me drive her to the airport where he waited, some mage 10 years older than her with his private jet and a French accent. I carried her bags to the back while she let him. He ran a hand through his hair and smiled grimly. I can feel her with him, through the bond. You'd think that I'd be more of a voyeur, but I can't enjoy it. It serves me right after the last time. Do I want to know? I used lust on her and kept her in my bed for 2 weeks. She missed classes, and for that she was quite put out, not to mention me forgetting that she owns me and not vice versa. Speaking of vice, I definitely don't want to know. He shrugged and took back the bottle, drinking long and deep before he lowered it, and looked out over the broken, rotting city. I can't do anything until she's done with him, or until she stops feeding me the awareness. She could keep this up for days. He closed his eyes and dug his fingers into his eye sockets. He didn't quite rip through the skin, just lowered his hand and kept drinking. Let me get this straight. You forced her to your bed, so she's going to take other mages to her bed and force you to. Watch. That doesn't sound all that bad. I can't touch another witch, though, and that's unendurable. She's putting a lot of effort into the bond, into controlling me when she doesn't usually work so hard. Did she say something to you? I frowned over the seething stillness of Old Scythe. It was her idea, binding Vinny and Zach. That probably means that it's a terrible plan or that it won't work. Don't be absurd. It is nothing if not competent. Don't let that pretty face make you forget exactly what she's capable of, which is of course anything. He downed the rest of the liquor and stood, throwing the bottle into the ruins. The breaking glass made a squishy, crunching noise. Ian turned to me with an elegant bow. I have been released from my torment. Shall we? His eyes glimmered gold as he prepared to use the magic that was as destructive as it was beautiful. Chapter 6. Watching Zach and Vinny fall desperately in love for 5 minutes, followed by an hour of both of them screaming at each other. And me, because of course Ian had winked at me and disappeared as soon as the binding sank deeply enough to last, so they couldn't scream at him. I had a migraine. Still, Zack had some life in him, which may have been the tubes that had been giving him more nourishment than he'd been giving himself. He ripped the needle out of him and lurched off the bed, promptly falling over into a precarious table and tray. I grabbed him and shoved him back onto the bed while Vinny scowled at me, like I'd betrayed her. Maybe I should have mentioned the lust part, but knowing that she disliked Ian, and who didn't after he'd done his damage, I decided it was better to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. "Get away from me," Zack snarled, shoving my hands off. He'd rather be face down on the floor than touch his ultimate betrayer. He wiped his mouth repeatedly on his arm. "I can't believe you and that witch did this to me." "Don't start with me." Vinny glowered at him. "I'd never in a million years kiss you, if that's what you call that slobbering, sucking thing your mouth was doing." She gagged in a charmingly exaggerated manner before scowling at me. She was doing a magnificent job of being angry in spite of her obsession. It was Ian, wasn't it? Of course not. If it was Ian, you two would have gone a lot further than kissing, don't you think? Vinny shuddered, and Zack hunched up like he was bracing himself for serious torture. They were adorable. They really had no chemistry, which would probably make them excellent allies. Think about it. You're both top tier in every way from academics to assets. Neither of you like margaritas, and you both play video games. You're the perfect match. Sign on this line and I'll release you from this hospital. Don't sign, and I'll have Ian put a lust spell on the two of you that will really knock your socks off, or some other articles of clothing. Jack bared his teeth at me. "I'm not signing anything. You don't own me, Drake. I'm not one of your little pet mages that will do your bidding for you. Don't forget who you're messing with." His eyes burned blue and magic crackled over his skin. It was very pretty. I patted his head, sending him back down against the pillow. He was still weak both from the potions that had kept him unconscious and his own lack of self-interest. "I wouldn't mess with you if I didn't care. You're my oldest friend. My next oldest friend is Ian, and I suppose he could try to take your place, but his spellcraft is worse than mine, and his tech isn't anywhere near the levels it would have to be to fill your shoes. It's a small binding to help you manage the agony you inflicted on yourself when you trusted your heart to a witch. Vinny can transfer it to someone else if you'd like, as there's a clause in the contract for that. Jasper oversaw it personally." "Jasper," he muttered, but the blue faded from his eyes, and he accepted the sandwich I handed him. It was his favorite, a disgusting concoction involving potato chips, salami, and rye. I'd personally asked my cook to make it for him. "What's on that?" Vinny muttered, peering at the other mage. "You don't want to know," I said, giving her a slight smile. She cleared her throat and tried to look like she hadn't been involved in that lip lock a moment before. It hadn't been very tasteful, which Ian must have done intentionally. My smile widened, and so did her eyes. Her glance fell on my lips and hers parted. I stepped back and turned to Zack. "Are you going to sign? I went to a lot of trouble to save you, so you should definitely be an appreciative damsel in distress." He sneered. "I'm not kissing you, although I'd prefer it over Vineldra Pinhouse." "No offense," he muttered in her direction. Her lips curled. "Right, not offensive at all, sign or not. I have holiday happiness to get back to." She rolled her eyes, scrawled her name on the contract, and then walked out, probably to find the nearest mirror she could walk through. When we were alone, he focused on his sandwich, but his brows were low over his blue eyes while he considered. When he'd finished his sandwich, he wiped the mustard off his fingers on the hospital sheet and crossed his arms, studying me. "Don't quote me on this, but I don't feel quite as bad as before. I can feel Vinny's whole. I'm so mad at the world thing and her whole Drake is so amazing thing, and while it's annoying, it cuts down on the gnawing insanity that is life-bound to pitch." "That fast?" He shrugged and closed his eyes. "Whatever you used on me is knocking me out again." I think that was the tree. I gripped his shoulder, relief touching my own gnawing insanity around the edges. When I came back from Darkside, he did his best to keep me to this world, and I would do my best to return the favor. "You're touching me," he mumbled, eyes still shut. "That's because I'm so touching. You should definitely be more appreciative of the effort I put into making you the slave of a diabolical witch. It's not that strong a binding. I could break it without a lot of effort." I held my breath, but released his shoulder instead of digging in my claws. But who wants to exert effort? It's much better to play video games." He smiled a crooked smile that was almost soft, eyes still closed like he trusted me or something. "Someday, you're going to fall in love with the worst witch, and she'll bring you to your knees, ruining your perfect suit. You won't care. And when you're ruined, I'm going to drop a Christmas tree on top of you so that you feel better." I laughed and ruffled his hair a little. "It's good to know that you've got my back. Backs were made to be broken, like hearts and collarbones." His smile turned sly. "That reminds me, I should probably go to my excellent bed for some rejuvenation. Will you sign? When I wake up, and if I'm in my right mind, I'll read the contract and see if it's a good alliance. Or you could sign now, with your eyes closed. That sounds much more interesting." He opened one eye. "Now you're sounding needy. Is life too hard to bear without me? Maybe you should take a witch with you to your rejuvenating bed." Vinny wouldn't protest, but she would protest leaving. I can only have a witch whose family wouldn't impact business after a very casual fling that didn't involve hearts or anything with the term seriouses in it. "All right, sign the contract or not, break the binding or not, but just know that I did everything in my power, as well as crossing quite a few lines, using the power of others in a shockingly unethical manner to drag you out of the abyss of misery which you so wantonly cast yourself into. I absolve myself. The next time you hang yourself, I'm getting popcorn and a chair to watch." I stepped through-side, leaving Zachary at the hospital in the little town near Rosewood Academy for witches and mages. I had a rejuvenating bed calling to me and my broken collarbone, but then again, the night was dark, filled with the cackling shrieks of witches, and a dozen good fights where a broken collarbone would get lost in the shuffle. It made much more sense to have a few more injuries before I took the necessary time to recuperate. That decided it. There was mayhem in Darkside to manage. Thank you for listening. Look for more adventures in the Darkly Sweet world and others created by Juliann Whicker.